It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. We've recently been getting a lot of requests for backlog creation workshops, which I thought was pretty amazing because for a while we didn't have any of the product owner specific story creation workshops that were being booked. And I think part of it was just people didn't understand the importance of mapping the breadth and depth of stories, and they didn't understand how to really get from. I think they discovered that the leap from the vision and strategy to a roadmap to tangible stories that could be journey mapped was quite the challenge. And I think that many people just didn't understand just how intense, how comprehensive it could be. So I thought I'd put together a quick podcast episode to discuss requirement definition and strategy and all that good stuff. So first, the first definition right out of the gate, what is requirement definition? So for me, if I refer into software, I would say requirement definition is the process of collecting information from stakeholders, analyzing it, and validating it to define what users can do with a specific set of software and how the software should behave. It's the most important process for everything that we do. Now, I want to point out that this doesn't always have to do with software. Sometimes you could do that very same thing with a product or service. So, let me give you three key reasons of why this is so important. So, the first reason has to do with avoiding developing unneeded features, often referred to as gold plating. This happens when teams realize that they have built features that the users didn't request or that they didn't want, or new things that happen. I mean, I've seen some of the most crazy things that have been built. The one that stands out to me the most was a piece of law enforcement software where it had a hidden Easter egg feature to help officers find a donut shop. And after much research, they discovered that no one actually used the feature. I don't even think it was used once. And the joke behind it was, well, they already knew where all those were. So they already knew where all those locations were. That was a silly Easter egg, right? But I think the point we're trying to make here is we want to avoid wasting time and we want to not build things that people don't need. So we don't want to build extra features if we don't have to. The second reading, the second reason is for more accurate estimation and forecasting. According to the concept of cone of uncertainty, estimation becomes significantly accurate after the definition of requirements has been done. Once you have some forecast, or once you have some definition of what the acceptance criteria is and how this story or backlog item should be laid out or executed, it's going to make the whole estimation process a whole lot easier. It's going to really speed things up, and your estimates are going to be far more accurate than they were before. The third reason is that subsequent processes such as technical or graphic design, coding, testing, marketing research will be determined based on what you have for these requirements. If the requirements are not clear, subsequent processes and things that happen after may lack quality and require additional rework. This is often referred to as the hidden factory. Things that you have to do over and over again when you should have greater clarity up front. And I know that means somebody stopped me and said, well, Lee, does Agile require pre work? And my answer was, of course it does. It requires minimal pre work in order to make sure that you have the right level of definition. Speaking of right level of definition, the number one question I get asked when I go to clients, and this is number one right out of the gate, is this sounds really interesting, but who should be defining the requirements? Well, the truth is it must be collaborative. So let me explain. So in the Agile Dad Agile Meetings Playbook, we have a whole section about the importance of understanding that the product owner can't be expected to do it all. While the product owner knows a lot, the product owner may be considered subject matter expert in many cases. It doesn't mean that they understand all of the strategic wants and needs of the organization. They don't understand all the wants, needs, whims, and desires of the end consumer. They may not understand all of the technological feasibility or impact. They may not understand all of the marketing prowess, or they may not understand all of the how campaigns run, or they may not understand even the user experience piece of it. I've seen many very knowledgeable product owners and product leaders that really just couldn't get their head around how a product would be used. The UX and UI piece was completely foreign to them. So I think what I'm trying to say here is we need to make sure, based on the type of product or service that you're building, that the product owner has the assistance they need in order to be successful. What type of assistance is that? Well, good question. We break it down into a business analyst, functional analyst, and technical analyst that I affectionately refer to as a BAFATA. And I want to make sure I point out the product owner is not a committee, it's a single person that makes all the decisions. But it's important for this person, the product owner, to have constituents that they can lean on to gather and glean information so that they can make better choices regarding the future of the product. Now, there comes a point where you need to involve the team to make sure that there was nothing that you missed, but that can usually be at a point of release planning where you're getting ready to gather the team's t shirt size estimates and figure those things out. But I think the initial definition of the backlog items or requirements, they need to be done by Po Bafata. And of course, if you're doing marketing or you're not doing something technical, you can make those adjustments to this group of people. But these people collectively collaborate and figure out what the requirements are and make sure that they have everything that they need from an understanding perspective to give it an initial sizing before they turn to the team and rely on a team to give it its final sizing at release planning to make sure we have the scope well defined and that this has entered a period where it's ready for refinement by the team. Whew, that was a mouthful. Okay, so when do we define requirements? Good question. So the initial requirements gathering in information gathering happens prior to the team ever grabbing hold. But the majority of the refinement or definition comes from the backlog refinement or grooming session. This is uh, this is what I call Agile's number one most missed unofficial event, right? This is where we review acceptance criteria. We talk about rank ordering. We talk about any dependencies that might exist. We try to avoid those, but we talk about them if we have them. This is where we really do those high level definitions and make sure that we understand. And we time box this to a few minutes per item to make sure we can get through all the items. And we make sure that we have a good understanding of how we're going to work with the product owner, how closely we're going to work with the product owner, and what level of refinement we're going to do inside of this session. I usually say this session should be limited to 1 hour per week per team. And I want to make sure that the team understands the guidelines of what we're trying to do before they enter this meeting, right? Another round of refinement happens at sprint planning. Sprint planning is what I call the final refinement. And this is how we want to make sure this ties to our sprint goal about why the sprint's valuable. We want to make sure that we understand what is expected of us, what we're trying to complete. And this is where we really do talk about the execution piece of how we feel we can execute this. Now, this is where it gets interesting because you should have had some of these initial conversations in the backlog grooming or backlog refinement session. So it should make this session lightweight and easier to palate. Okay, the next question comes how to define requirements. Well, there's so many different practices about how to define requirements and what you're going to do. So most people use the whole user story, mycone, user stories to pull out, applied, and defined. And this is the as a who, I would like to do what, so that why. As a user, I want to log into a credential bearing site so I can leave valuable survey feedback from my instructor. I don't know. I'm just making something up here. Another way to define requirements is through the acceptance criteria. The current most popular syntax is Gherkin. Given a specific state when an action takes place, then I expect this outcome or result. So this is a common thing these days. And the reason why Gherkin's so common is because it's really an easy syntax. There's a small learning curve, and it really does help people to write in real terms what's going to be happening, and it's easy to test. And then, of course, for people who need the more visual image, wireframe, prototype design, those type of things work too. So it really is, it's not as much of a challenge when you understand that you can creatively come up with whatever you need in order to drive how you're going to flow. And the visual sometimes helps with avoiding misunderstandings about how things are going to be implemented. Of course, Ron Jeffries originally mentioned the whole three C's as part of the extreme programming, that we have a card, which is a placeholder for a future conversation, a conversation or a meeting to discuss, and then confirmation, which is validation of the acceptance criteria. Once again, really good advice from Ron Jeffries. This is a practice that I use all the time. And you can tie all this together. And of course, you can come back and use visual image on top of this if necessary in order to give it even greater clarification. So I guess that's part of the whole mapping process. And then, of course, you have William Wake. He came up with the INVEST framework, where he said all stories should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, sized appropriately, and testable. Independent means we should avoid dependencies. Negotiable obviously means it's a placeholder for a future conversation. Valuable means it must provide value. Estimable means we must have the ability to put some type of t-shirt size on it. Sized appropriately means it must fit in a single sprint. And testable, of course, means if we can't test it, we probably shouldn't be doing it. So I think the whole thing that's important here is to understand that when you're doing requirements or backlog items, you need to know that there's a who, what, where, when, why, and how. It's important to decide what you're not going to build. It's important for you to talk about things collaboratively. The product backlog refinement or grooming session and sprint planning are opportunities where you can really dig in and figure out what you need to do. The user story should be simple and to the point. The acceptance criteria should be easy to understand. Leverage visual images when you can. And remember to invest in good stories. If you do that, you'll be successful. That's going to do it for this episode of the Daily Stand Up Podcast. If you have a topic you want us to talk about, send it over to learnmore@agiledad.com. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.